Afternoon, everyone. Today is April 1st of 2021. We will be having Dr. Jelena Petrovic, an associate professor of communication and media studies, who will be presenting on Wishful Humanitarianism from the Edge of Europe, which is the news coverage of 2015 European refugee crisis in Serbia. Thank you, Dr. Petrovic.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for attending the session today. I know it's really busy time of the semester and in the middle of the day, so I do really appreciate that you're here today with me, listening to my work in progress. So, as you can see from the title here, my focus is on a country that is in Europe, south of Europe, and about the event that actually is, by some standards, maybe old. So I'm going to be focusing a little bit on rationale for even talking about this today, maybe like a little bit about my framework that is guiding the questions and the project itself. And then I want to just really briefly talk about some preliminary ideas that I have that came as a result of the analysis that I have already done. So this project is actually part of my long, never-ending research agenda that focuses on immigration. But most of the things that you're going to be hearing about today came from the work that I have done thanks to the summer research grant about 5 years ago, and also my sabbatical, which concluded last spring. So during my sabbatical, I was in Serbia and working on this, and just one kind of statement from a friend really like stood out to me and really in some ways shaped the approach to this project. So it was just about to be a lockdown for the pandemic, and my friend said that there's kind of like a story circling in the town that the government will use the lockdown meaning like nobody can be on the street during like certain hours, to actually bring in thousands of immigrants from EU, immigrants that EU actually doesn't want, these refugees from 2015 that somehow they will be brought in to Serbia and kind of like secretly placed in Serbia in different places. So there was like a worry and a little bit of conspiracy theory that was guiding my friend's comment. Now that obviously like it's conspiracy theory, and it's not something necessarily that I want to focus on, but it really stood out to me because it really highlighted the change in the way that immigration and especially refugee crisis has been thought of in Serbia in a fairly short time span. So I actually really always like to show this picture as a way to capture this switch, or sort of like the contradiction that emerged even in 2015 when the crisis was in the like on the height of the crisis. So this image basically showcases this park in the capital of Serbia, Belgrade, that was basically a home for a really long time for many people, thousands of people, refugees who were just trying to get to various EU countries. Now you cannot see refugees in this image because what you see on your right on the image is actually like a redoing of the grass in the park that kind of came out of nowhere. You can imagine that area was, full of people one day, and the next day the kind of trucks showed up and decided it's time to change the grass in the park. Which is just kind of interesting because it conveys this duality. On one hand, Serbia welcomed the refugees and kind of gave a very like humane, approach to the whole crisis. Refugees were everywhere. We could have seen them. They were getting like help. I will talk a little bit more about that in a second. And yet, in the same time, there was sort of like desire to push them away. So I think that this image sort of like leads me to a specific way to think about this event and to kind of tackle these three questions. So first of all, why refugee crisis? I mean, it's an event that happened in 2015 and according to EU has ended. And really, you cannot hear about it in the media anyways. So why this event, first of all? The event was major. It actually involved millions of people moving mainly from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and also some African countries, mainly to Europe and mainly to EU. And it was, very visible. It was followed by the media. It involved like actually changes in the EU itself. It was also tied to several really high profile cases. One is Brexit. So the refugee crisis has been used as a way to like actually justify Brexit. There was a death of Alan Kurdi, who is a little boy whose body was washed off on the shores of Italy. That image circulated the world and kind of raised the awareness of the event. And then, of course, there's a terrorist attack in Paris that was kind of linked to the people who were migrating. So it was like really major event. And I'm using passive tense here as a way to talk about the question number 2, why now? According to everything that we know, we would say this crisis has ended. Once again, we don't really talk about it. The European Commission actually proclaimed in 2019 that the crisis is over and that we can move past that. However, what is so significant here is that actually crisis is not over. What this kind of invisibility of refugees really tells us, or really actually hides, is the actually background process, and the process is tightening up security of the borders, focusing more and more on externalizing border control, which basically means putting resources outside your own countries to the countries and places where the refugees will come in first. So your own citizens really don't see the refugees because migration is managed way before people even get to your doors. So EU has engaged in those practices. Serbia has engaged in those practices. So while we don't see refugees, and we might think that they're not relevant, actually there's all these things happening in the background that actually hides refugees and migrants from our public sight. So that's why now it's still there. We are just not seeing it. And then why Serbia? I mean, out of all places, why this fairly small country in Europe that is not actually even the destination for many refugees? They don't even want to stay in Serbia. Well, Serbia is quite significant, in my opinion, for numerous reasons. One is because it was one of the major stops on a very important route for refugees in 2015 and 16. That route is called Balkan Route, and it was passing straight through Serbia. Serbia is bordering with Hungary and Croatia. Both of the countries are in EU, so they're like part of the space that refugees really wanted to enter in. But Serbia is not an EU member. Serbia is only an EU candidate, which means that we have some privileges, but we are really not part of the Schengen space. We are not part of that market and all these other things. So Serbia is relevant in that way. It is on the stop, is one of the stops, but it's also like the last stop before EU. And this was in a lot of ways significant because once Hungary and other countries started closing their borders, all these people actually technically and literally got stuck in Serbia. And the image on the right captures that, I think, visually quite well. This is like the image from the border crossing between Serbia and Hungary. And you can see all these people like basically not being able to pass through. Also, in terms of numbers, all these like refugee crisis and people created like really visible change in public life in Serbia, in politics. Also, as you can see, based on these numbers, the numbers raised were like significantly higher than what is usually expected. Just in September 2016, so between 2015 and September 2016, about 700,000 people came across Serbia. Now that's unprecedented, obviously very visible, obviously it creates crises and it calls for like our action. So that's just kind of like basically like why Serbia, like in that sense, it's geopolitically very significant. But in terms of the question that I want to ask for this, I find Serbia also very significant too. So my interest is in how through discourse we create certain notions of what it means to have solidarity with immigrants and how discourse calls us to act. So like focusing on humanitarianism in Serbia, here are the things that are significant for you to know, to understand, and like the things that are guiding me. So first of all, Serbia has been praised, as I said, for its humane response to crisis. Really, we didn't close the border, we were letting everyone in. There was a massive sort of like work on the ground organizations, NGOs, civil society. It just felt like people are really wanting to help. Like, right, like people were donating stuff. There was food that was given to people in various occasions. I mean, you're managing really a significant number of people, and you're still like managing to provide support and basic resources. So that was very evident, and I observed that when I was in Serbia in 2015. Also, there is a history of migration in Serbia due to wars, civil wars, and also Serbia is a country of emigration. So many people actually leave Serbia constantly. So there is sort of like understanding that is there, cultural, historical, that people like can refer to, and they can identify with people who are also very different from them. So there is also that part that is significant in this context. Also, there was a flexibility of laws that actually allow people to stay and basically violate laws, but they were not prosecuted for it. Not to kind of go in too much detail about this, but there's sort of like a rule when you enter a country, if you don't have other reasons except to apply for asylum, you have to do it during the certain period of time, and you get a paper to stay, but that also has expiration date that is fairly short, right? And then you kind of have to enter the process. So people were getting these papers to stay in Serbia, but they were not entering the process themselves. And they were able to get these papers over and over again, which is just telling us that the law wasn't really like applied in a way that technically should be applied to actually manage the crisis itself. There was really downplaying of the incidents if there were fights or some attacks that were happening or interactions that were not desirable by public. Really, media wasn't highlighting that, which was also really interesting. And finally, Serbia has decided for a really long time not to raise any fences and to actually let people in and let them pass through. So that's one side. And the contradicting side is basically that there are a lot of reasons why we should not be thinking about pro-immigration discourse in Serbia. Here are some things. Racism and discrimination is very much alive in Serbia, especially toward Muslims and especially toward Roma people. And these populations are coming from regions that, Serbians usually don't like, right, and have certain stereotypes regarding people coming from these regions. Serbia is also a post-socialist country, which means that its asylum system and just immigration control and management is quite underdeveloped. So there is no really infrastructure for it. And then we also have high levels of corruption and very sort of like a cult of personality that guides politics. So like thinking about possibility for political action, you really have to take into account, right, that political actions and laws and initiatives will be really much driven by corruption and sort of like a desire to stay in power in different ways. And then finally, when it comes to like changes and in general just treating immigration in certain ways, Serbia is tied very much to EU politics because Serbia is an EU candidate forever and ever. And of course, like it tries to like align itself to the politics of EU, but also in some ways to resist that politics. So like whatever is happening in Serbia is never really like free from those impacts or those influences. Okay, so this is just a little bit about sort of framing the project and the question, why even look at the crisis, refugee crisis from 2015 in this small country, such as Serbia, right? And I think like we can actually like make a lot of reasons for that. And I think the case study is significant because it could tell us a lot about the power of discourse to both have great potential for pro-immigration ideas and solidarity with immigrants, but also it shows us how quickly that potential can be foreclosed. And I'm very much interested to see how actually media have contributed to that foreclosing of that possibility. So these are the three questions that are guiding my project. So of course, like what kind of like ideas are advanced in the media coverage of this crisis? What is the responsibility and solidarity that is invoked through that coverage? And then maybe practically what things journalists can do differently to preserve the potential for very kind of radical, absolute solidarity with immigrants that was actually like possible in Serbia, at least for some period of time. I believe that very deeply, actually. So just really quickly, some of the theoretical framework that is guiding these questions and answering these questions. So one is just simply thinking about immigration as a discourse and how immigration is framed as a problem. So these two authors list like these phases through which the talk about immigration goes through in the media, amongst politicians, even within public. So those phases are defining the immigration in certain ways, claiming it as our problem or somebody else's problem, legitimizing the response by invoking science, statistics, politics, then expanding the problem to other areas like economy, cultural concerns, humanitarianism, things like that. And then sensationalizing, right? Pulling out cases that you can kind of like normalize and say, this is what is actually happening. Oftentimes, right, if it's a negative narrative, you would highlight crime or threat or something along those lines. And then suggesting is like implying what are the consequences and courses of action that you do to solve this problem. Aside from this, I also pull from Nguyen from 2012. She wrote a really great book, Freedom as a Gift, The Gift of Freedom, my apologies, in which she talks about this conditional solidarity. In other words, we might grant freedom to somebody through asylum, for example, by granting somebody an asylum. But the way that's done, it always presumes sort of like this was a gift that we want something in return for, right? And in terms of refugees, that's like the call, always to prove that you're worthy of this gift, always being exceptional, never making mistake, and things like that. So that's another sort of line of theoretical um, ideas that I'm pulling from for this project. And then finally, I looked at this work from Chilayaki and Stolich, who are talking about visuals, especially in the media, and how the visuals invoke certain kind of responsibility to act. And I really appreciate their definition of responsibility as a symbolic practice of power that invests the images of the refugees crisis with distinct moral claims to action. And just to give you some examples of types of visuals that they are like actually discussing, a couple of those will be significant for my project. So one is portraying immigrants, in this case refugees, as children for the most part. So infantilizing refugees, you focus on individual plight, innocence, children, babies, distress, clueless, powerless. When you show those kinds of images, the action that it invokes is basically empathy that maintains separation. So it's empathy, not like let's find common ground, but it's empathy. I feel your suffering, but you're still different from me. And it's usually like done as a colonial paternalism, right? Like you're above the refugees and you're giving them something. And immigrants are usually spoken about, never spoken. They're never speaking for themselves. The other one is massification. When you simply present masses, you either talk about people as masses or you present them visually as masses. You're really focusing on bare life, biological life. So you focus on sanitary conditions, you focus on very like clear suffering, lack of resources, even clothing, right? Like just not having just bare life. And you like really kind of highlighting that. Um, and in this case, like refugees are always really dependent on others for help. And you don't really provide any context for what caused the suffering itself. This is also really common for refugee crises. Nobody really explains why the refugee crisis even started and what is the responsibility of the Western countries in actually creating the refugee crisis. You're just focusing on refugees coming and showing them in certain light. The action that is created through these kinds of images is basically being shocked and saying, "Oh wow, this has happened," and then moving forward. So like almost no engagement really with the situation, or not feeling much responsibility to what you're observing. And then the last one is the one that I think is going to be significant for my project, is called marginalization, which is in some ways focusing on refugees, but as a way to critique the system and critique the argument. That all sounds really good and potentially quite radical and quite progressive and pro-immigration. But the problem with these kinds of like images is that we are speaking for immigrants. and their humanity is only recognized as so much as it helps our case. So our goal is really to critique the government and the system, but it's not really to take in refugees with their full humanity, or their like to focus on them as individuals. So the issues with that is obviously that immigrants are not recognized as political actors or people who actually organize their life in particular ways. They're spoken for, again, and we are actually defending their rights at the cost of marginalizing their own voices. So really the fight is the more important thing than actually the people that we are fighting for. All right, so those are just some elements that frame the project itself. What I would like to spend the remaining of my presentation is to just briefly discuss some of the preliminary findings that I have. My general argument is leaning toward the idea of limiting what could be seen as absolute solidarity, right? Giving solidarity to immigrants with no questions asked, being in solidarity with immigrants because it is humans who are suffering, humans that are like us. So rather than kind of having that, limiting that and turning that type of solidarity into what I preliminarily call something like relative solidarity. Solidarity that is prefaced or conditioned based on specific other factors. So my interest is to explore how we have moved from potential for absolute solidarity in the news coverage to this idea of like limited or relative solidarity. So in order to get to that, I looked at about 800 news articles that were published in 3 news outlets, national news outlets in Serbia, and I focused only in 2015, even though the stories range from January to December. They were published, obviously, the full year. The majority of the stories came in June, July, August, September, October, November. So like the second half of the year, which coincides with actually the escalation of the crisis itself. Just really quickly, timeline. So the crisis becomes visible like early in 2015, but by June, Hungary is the first country that kind of talks about raising a razor fence, which is antithetical to like EU principles. And that really just kind of turned the crisis around in a negative way. So no wonder the news coverage was really prominent at that time. So here are some preliminary thoughts that I have on this. So one of the first observation is that the media discourse in this time is inconsistent in terms of narrative, framing, and labeling. Sorry, my transitions didn't work when we transferred them to Blackboard, so please try not to be overwhelmed with the amount of text that is on the slides. I will try to guide us through some of these text as I move forward. So just really quickly what this means. Inconsistency in the media coverage of immigration is not uncommon. That's not new, right? Like it's just part of like professional norms. Journalists will focus on the events that are emerging. There might not be like ideological story, or there might not be uniform ideology that guides the coverage, right? Like, so you can see the shifts in the coverage. That's not new. But what is so significant with the coverage in Serbia is that these inconsistencies and shifts happen in a matter of days. So imagine like, right, like you're an audience that reads about this and you're getting very sort of like contradicting messages, even in a single story. So what I pulled out are these headlines that were published like in less than a month for this one outlet. Now, for you will be really hard to kind of like get at what headlines like actually like cover, like what was the story about. But I can tell you that these headlines move from immigrants are threat. Oh my gosh, look at these numbers. They're coming in these numbers, like huge waves are coming, to like talking about, we should care about these immigrants. We should really like pay attention to them. We should help them. Then also there's contradictory messages saying these are valid refugees and these are economic migrants. So like you really do not know like what really is the case here. Then even in a single story, you would have contradicting statements from political officials, from government officials. So you would have the Prime Minister Vucic, who said, we are letting everyone in, we're going to help everybody, everyone is going to be taken care of, we will not raise fences. we are here to be humane about this. And then like the story will go, and the last paragraph will be like, for example, a statement from the Minister of Internal Affairs, who would say citizens should be assured that national interest and national security is our priority. All these migrants are checked. We're not letting anyone in who is a threat, basically, a statement along those lines. So you would have these like very inconsistent messages that appear in the narratives and in the framings of the immigration or the crisis. And then there is also inconsistency in terms of labels. So who are these people? And this is appearing across all three news outlets. So sometimes labeling, we can explain it by ideological underpinning of the outlet. And we can see that the United States, like CNN versus Fox, will have very different like terms to use when they talk about immigration. But this is not an explanation for what is happening in this news coverage, because all three news outlets use a range of terms to like actually refer to immigrants with no like very clear pattern how this happens. So you have terms like immigrant, asylum seeker, refugee, illegal immigrant, economic immigrant, emigrant even, which is absolutely inaccurate. And then a range of terms that describe basically human suffering, like this poor people, these unfortunates, these people who have suffered a lot. And there's just not consistency in exactly like how are we talking about refugees in this case. So that's like the first observation that I had. The second observation that I noted is that the media discourse really promotes the idea of conditional humanitarianism. And by conditional here, I don't necessarily think like we let these people in and we want to help them, but we expect something in return. Like what the Nguyen talked about earlier. Yeah, I mentioned that when I was talking about my theory. Conditional humanitarianism here comes from like a different angle, which is also pretty intriguing. The first way in which it comes through is through the use of the term transit country, to say that Serbia is the transit country. Now, this notion of being transit space is deeply embedded in Serbian national discourse. Serbia is on the edge of Europe, literally and figuratively. It was always recognized by other European countries as sort of like European country, but way too close to Middle East or like just Asia. So it's not really a European country. And for Serbia, historically, this has been like a main sort of metaphor, a bridge or a crossroad between East and West. And so that has been there for a while, and it really makes sense to invoke that idea again when you're covering immigration. So transit country kind of captures that a little bit. So what we're seeing is kind of like allows this political flexibility, where in one hand you can talk about humane treatment, but also you can say we are not a parking area for migrants because we are transit country. They don't really want to stay here. So that's kind of like the first thing. And what is so significant, while this label really made sense at the beginning, because Serbia is a transit country, most of these people really don't want to stay in Serbia. That was reality. However, once they all got stuck in Serbia, we have very different situation. I don't think you can claim that Serbia is a transit country at that moment anymore, right? So that label is continuously used, even though the situation really doesn't justify the use of that term based on what's happening on the ground. The second way in which humanitarianism and solidarity is conditioned is through comparisons. So you would have statements like the one that you're seeing, where politicians would say, we will not build any buildings or concentration camps for migrants. It's kind of like stating like this absolute solidarity. We're just not going to do this. We're going to be humane as much as we can. But what this statement is not necessarily telling you on the surface is that this is actually a reference to what other countries are doing to manage this crisis, specifically Hungary. So once the Hungary decided to raise a razor fence and basically prevent migrants from coming through, you could have seen in the news media sort of like these comparisons. Look what Hungary is doing. That's horrible. That is anti-European. Look what Croatia is doing. And we are not doing that. We are going to be humane. So rather than kind of like framing humanitarianism or having humane treatment as just something that we do because it's the right thing to do, which might be suggested in this statement. Actually, where this is coming from is we are doing this because we are not like others who are doing something else. And then the third kind of like way in which I think this conditional humanitarianism is articulated in the news discourse is that almost no news story really presents a possibility for immigrants to stay and integrate in society. In other words, every time they talk about migrants, they will really highlight that they really don't want to stay in. They never really talk about how migrants have organized life in Serbia because now they're stuck and they're staying not for days, they're staying for months. Some people even stayed for more than a year because they just couldn't get out, right, and go where they wanted to go. So there is really no story about migrants, refugees in this case, being part of our way of living, right, in some ways. Very limited stories about people who decided to pursue asylum process and actually try to stay in Serbia. Very small number of those stories. Which is maybe understandable because very small number of people wanted to stay. But I think like media have missed the opportunity to sort of like help the readers envision a different possibility. Thus building on that sort of empathy and solidarity that public has been showing toward these migrants, toward these refugees. But media never really like followed that up and really got stuck with this notion of we are just a transit country. None of these people really want to stay. So that's the second one. And just really briefly, the third one, and I would like to wrap up with that, is that most of the stories did bring in migrants' voices. You would actually have, from just basic description of what's happening on the ground to actually interviewing migrants, naming them, trying to get their stories, telling where they're from. So real like individual approach, that was kind of common from what I could have tell from the stories that I analyzed. But unfortunately, most of them really focused on the idea of bare life, which is the thing that I mentioned earlier in this presentation, where really like in the first quote there, you can see like highlighting the suffering in a very like dramatic, descriptive way. And then in the second one, I don't want you necessarily to read the whole thing, but basically what this story was about babies that families have left as they were trying to get in line and get through the process of being registered when they arrived to Serbia. And then they lost their babies. And police officers found these babies and reunited them with family. So there was like this story kind of like highlighting these difficult choices the families are doing and how we are helping them with all this. So while this is all like great in some ways because it kind of brings humanity back to these refugees, it again really focuses on their like sort of like their life. It doesn't really treat them as political agents. It doesn't really treat them as people who have ways to organize their life again in different ways, even in conditions that are not really good conditions, right? They're different conditions than the ones that they maybe had in their home countries, which kind of like really reinforces that idea from earlier that I'll just kind of go there, that massification and marginalization may be like bringing in ideas of these are like people who are suffering, we really need to be paying attention to this, but they're doing it in a way where it's really like refugees humanity, their individuality, their needs are subordinated or like taken as secondary compared to like other primary interests, which could be to showcase a certain face, to reach certain political agendas, or to simply to feel a little bit better about ourselves. So with that all being said, I would like to stop here. These are just my preliminary thoughts. And once again, all of those findings hopefully will enable me to really make an argument that there is a potential in the discourse for advancing very different, very unusual in some ways, pro-immigration ideas and very like radical and once again absolute solidarity with immigrants. And once again, I really do believe that there were elements of it, but unfortunately, aside from politicians and maybe aside from like politics in EU, media contributed to actually foreclosing that by simply kind of following certain maybe professional norms or writing certain kinds of stories that really didn't capitalize on the potential that was obviously there and that was evident even on the ground. So thank you all so much for listening to some of these preliminary ideas, as I said, and I'm really looking forward for maybe some questions or suggestions that you might have for me. Thank you.
Right now we have McFarland, wonderful for them. I'm glad to have this opportunity to hear you speak about your work, Dean Scott. I see that Harry has already turned on his video. If you have a question?
Yeah, I'll let you finish talking.
That's it. I was just reading off what I had seen from the message board.
Okay. Hi, Jelena. It's nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you too.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask a probably a really naive question because I'd like to learn something for a second. And there's this trend of nationalist, populist type of government ideology, et cetera, that's expanding right throughout Europe and other places. The United States is dealing with it. And one of the things that struck me, and maybe you addressed this, but I didn't catch it, was when this wave, this unbelievable wave, this human wave started to cross the Mediterranean, right, and go up through the Levant and come in to like the area of Serbia, etc. Do you think the ultimate response that led to this just horrific humanitarian crisis would have been as great if the ideological disposition had been different? Does that make sense? So if populism hadn't been so present, does that make sense?
So if I'm Harry, like correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're wondering how the sort of political climate in some of these places, some of the climate reflecting populism, right, like in being really entrenched in that, kind of shape the response that we've seen, and whether the outcome would be different if populism nationalism wasn't one of the current developments in Europe. Is that a question?
Right. And I mean, there might be an obvious answer to it, but that part of the world, right, is like a melting pot already, and it's had, like you said, it's had its experience. Oh my gosh, it's with just catastrophic human interactions, right? And so I was just wondering,
So I actually think that the answer is not really simple. I think that's a good question, and I think maybe Serbia illustrates the complexity of that question. So I think like oftentimes we equate populism with anti-immigrant discourse, and I think that's absolutely right? Because you're like very nationalistic, you're protecting your community, and obviously immigrants don't fit into that. Now, Serbia actually had really like developed populism. And as I said, which is so interesting, is that actually the government in Serbia operates on the cult of personality, right? Like we have this like leader who has been in power like forever and ever. And the way he like uses his speeches, his rhetoric is very populistic, like very much sort of like, look, I'm the savior of you, it's our people. And Serbia is not the most welcoming country either. Like, right. So I think what is interesting is then that there was all this like sort of understanding of these immigrants who are very different than majority of Serbians. Majority of Serbians are white and identify as Orthodox Christians. We're talking about people who are coming from Middle East, right? Who are
right,
most likely
right.
Muslims, right? I mean, it's just so it's just kind of like a really unexpected situation in some ways. But that's what I'm kind of like trying to think through is that I don't think that necessarily like populism is the only way to explain why people would have pro or anti-immigration sentiment. I think it's like other factors that play into particular situation that oftentimes get ignored. And the explanations are oftentimes reduced to that, like populism, nationalism.
Yeah, I appreciate that because I'm just trying to wrap my as a non-European, a person who does not have that experience, right? And I know that Serbia and other country, they all have their own minority populations, you know, with all of the tensions and all of the luggage, if you will, that's associated with majority minority population interactions. And I'm really curious, why is it so different, but you've answered. I think I need to learn more about it. So if you can point me in the right direction, because I'm really interested in learning more about why this turned out to be such a catastrophe, you know?
Well, I mean, one way to think through it is also like the politics in EU. I mean, that's another kind of explanation. We've seen that actually EU countries responded differently. And we know that Germany, for example, really like tried to promote this pro-immigration, let's help out, we're responsible for taking these people. There are other countries that were advocating for quota system, where each EU country will take a certain number of immigrants. And then you have a bloc that was resisting that. And kind of like unexpected bloc, we have Hungary, which is a country that is not highly regarded in EU, but somehow this sort of like really xenophobic, like approach to immigration, even though immigrants would not even stay in Hungary, by the way, which is the most fascinating thing. So we have this, I don't want to call it a fringe country, that's not the right qualification, but in terms of just EU kind of hierarchy, Hungary is not, the player in some ways. And yet this country somehow managed to like make their needs, their concerns, like the forefront of the EU politics. So even the countries that were open to immigrants and kind of like were hoping to manage this by, equally distributing in some ways the numbers, all of a sudden when you were not able to do that, we had the rise of anti-immigration sentiments in these countries too. So I think it's like part of the enigma is understanding also the kind of politics within EU, and like why that has failed, even though it had potential in that case to be something else. And maybe I'm naive here, saying that there is potential for being really empathetic and to be in solidarity with immigrants. Maybe that's never really possible. And maybe it's just always like a possibility that can never be realized. But I think it's in order to understand why it doesn't happen, I don't think it's one answer for all. I think it's really important to understand politics and history and the context of the place where the kind of immigration arises as an issue.
Thank you, Jelena. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Harry. I think that Tara wrote down a really good question about vaccination and COVID-19 in Serbia. So yeah, I definitely should look into this. I think that this will help a bit more to kind of make an argument of why this event from 2015 is still relevant. So I have to explore more about vaccination, but one of the things that kind of was brought up during the lockdowns was what's happening with migrants. Like they were really forbidden from leaving the reception centers, and that's a controversy because you were limiting their movement even more than you were of the regular residents and citizens. So if I'm not mistaken, they were even confined. They couldn't even leave during the times when other citizens could leave their apartments and be outside on the streets. So it's still there. Refugees are still relevant, especially with this sort of pandemic and what's going on. So I definitely need to look into vaccination and what has happened. So thank you for bringing that up, Tara.
Thanks, Jelena. I had just seen an article the other day that said that Serbia had started vaccinating residents of migrant and refugee camps, where they, something about them like, it's hard to do social distancing in the camps. And because they had secured a range of different vaccines, and I think the article mentioned the China's Sinopharm vaccine and the Sputnik 5 vaccine out of Russia, that they had reached like the record high for per capita inoculation rates in mainland Europe. And so they had started extending it to the migrant and refugee camps. And I was just curious, like, you know, it connects to what you're saying. And I wonder how the media is covering it, if they're still kind of covering it in the same way, or if something has shifted, and just thought I'd ask.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And if you remember and you kind of have easy access to the article, I would like to see it. And just maybe like try to follow up with some of these things. Yeah, I think that's extremely important and interesting.
If I can find it, I'll send it.
Thank you so much.
All right. I think that's all the questions that we have at this point.
Seems like.
All right. Well, again, thank you, Dr. Petrovic, for coming and speaking to us through this virtual format. We appreciate it a lot to be able to do that. We think we have one more question. Hang on. No, just some support. This will be posted very quickly, actually, most likely by tomorrow afternoon. 24-hour turnaround is usually what we go for on this. So anyone else that y'all know of that wishes to see this, please let them know. The moment it's posted, we'll be sending it to you, Dr. Petrovic, to let you know for anyone who you want to send that out to.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris, for hosting this space for us. And thank you all so much for your attention and, you know, finding time in everyone's busy schedule to listen and engage with me. I really do appreciate it, and really great comments and questions. Thank you.